Life does not always announce its weight through disaster. Often it settles in quietly, without spectacle, without explanation, as a pressure that does not bruise the skin, but makes movement costly. You wake, you rise, you proceed, and nothing in particular is wrong. Yet each action carries a density that did not need to be earned. This heaviness is not drama, it is not tragedy, it is simply there, waiting at the threshold of consciousness. You notice it most when nothing interrupts you, when the day has been orderly, when duties have been fulfilled without resistance, when no acute sorrow demands attention. The weight becomes unmistakable. It does not come from thought, nor from emotion in the ordinary sense, but from the sheer persistence of being required to remain, to continue, to occupy time without justification. Those who have not felt this believe suffering must be loud. They look for brokenness, for obvious wounds, for visible losses that can be named and exchanged for sympathy. But this condition resists display. It has no narrative that can be offered without embarrassment. One hesitates to speak of it, because nothing appears sufficiently damaged to warrant complaint. Yet the body knows. It carries itself differently under this quiet load. Movement slow, not from age but from reluctance. Even rest loses its promise, because rest no longer feels like a restoration but merely a pause before the same demand resumes. Sleep does not reset the ledger. It only interrupts it briefly, without altering the balance. This is not depression in the theatrical sense. There is no collapse, no melodrama, no crisis that begs for intervention. There is simply the recognition that effort now exceeds reward in all directions. The simplest tasks ask more than they return. The most pleasant moments fail to justify their preparation. Pleasure, when it arrives, feels thin and already exhausted. Desire once functioned as a motor. It pulled the will forward with the promise that something ahead would compensate for what was endured. But desire has a limited lifespan. It depends on ignorance to maintain its strength. Once its promises have been observed closely enough, it loses credibility. It begins to sound repetitive, even dishonest. At first, this realization appears as maturity. One believes one has become realistic, balanced, no longer fooled by excess expectation. But soon it reveals another aspect. Without desire's pressure, time opens up not as freedom, but as exposure. Hours become longer, not fuller. Days stretch without contour, asking to be filled, though nothing feels necessary. What replaces desire is not peace. It is not contentment. It is a neutral endurance that lacks language. You continue not because you are drawn, but because stopping would require more energy than remaining upright. The will does not disappear. It simply ceases to aim. In this state, hope becomes suspect. It no longer consoles, it irritates. Each hopeful thought feels like an additional obligation imposed on an already strained interior. To hope is to rehearse disappointment in advance. To imagine improvement is to reopen a wound that had at least scarred over into something manageable. Thus, hope, once considered a virtue, begins to feel like noise. It intrudes where silence had become tolerable. It demands emotional investment in outcomes that history has already rendered improbable. You do not reject hope out of bitterness. You set it aside out of fatigue. People misunderstand this. They interpret the absence of hope as despair, because they cannot imagine a position that exists beyond that opposition. But despair still believes in significance. It still protests. What you experience is quieter. It does not argue with reality. It simply ceases to expect generosity from it. Life under this condition does not feel tragic. Tragedy implies exception, a fall from height, a violation of what should have been otherwise. This feels ordinary, even inevitable. The weight does not accuse life of wrongdoing. It merely registers the cost of participation. The world continues to function around you with impressive efficiency. Conversations proceed. Obligations renew themselves without malice. Social rituals repeat their gestures as if repetition itself were sufficient justification. You do not feel persecuted by this machinery. You simply feel unnecessary to it, and yet unable to withdraw. This produces a peculiar loneliness, not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of being fully included without being inwardly addressed. You are present everywhere, yet nothing speaks to you directly. Everything functions. Nothing answers. At this point, many attempt distraction. They seek noise, activity, stimulation, movement. For a time, it works. Motion can imitate purpose, and sound can cover the silence beneath. But distraction demands energy, and energy is precisely what has become scarce. Eventually, the effort to escape the weight adds to it. When distraction fails, one often turns inward, hoping to locate meaning there. But introspection, under these conditions, yields no revelation. It reveals only the same neutrality, the same absence of directive force. The self does not rise to the occasion. It remains, observes, and withholds instruction. This is often the moment when one realizes that clarity itself has a cost. To see accurately is not empowering. It removes illusions that once functioned as supports. You are no longer deceived about the nature of satisfaction. You no longer believe that fulfillment waits just beyond the next adjustment. This is not cynicism, it is observation. Clarity strips life of its exaggerations. It reduces experience to what it can reliably deliver, which is far less than what was once promised. In doing so, it does not replace illusion with compensation. It replaces it with silence, a silence that does not soothe, but also does not lie. Under this silence, endurance becomes the default posture. Not endurance as virtue, not endurance as heroism, but endurance as fact. You endure because there is no alternative that requires less effort. To exist is to bear weight. To cease would require a decision, and decisions require energy. Thus, days pass without dramatic markers. You do not count them as progress. You do not mourn them as losses. They accumulate like sediment, quietly, without commentary. Memory itself changes character. The past no longer glows or wounds. It flattens. Social life becomes especially peculiar here. Others continue to speak the language of aspiration, of improvement, of becoming. You recognize the vocabulary, but it no longer corresponds to your internal landscape. You do not argue with them. You let the words pass, understanding that they serve a function for those who still require them. This creates distance without conflict. You are not opposed to others. You simply no longer share their urgency. Their enthusiasms sound sincere, but faintly theatrical. Their disappointments feel disproportionate. You observe without correction, because correction would imply belief in an alternative arrangement that you no longer perceive. In quiet moments, you may notice time itself changing texture. It no longer rushes, nor does it crawl. It becomes uniform. Hours resemble one another not because nothing happens, but because events no longer imprint themselves with significance. Without desire, experience loses contrast. This is often misinterpreted as numbness, but numbness implies injury. What you experience is intact sensation without valuation. You feel, you register, you respond, but nothing insists on being remembered. Consciousness continues its work without commentary. There is a certain dignity in this state. Though it does not advertise itself, it does not console, it does not elevate, it simply stands. To see without exaggeration, to endure without complaint, to remain without illusion, these are not achievements, but they are accurate positions. Accuracy, however, is rarely comforting. It offers no narrative arc, no resolution. It does not promise that the weight will lessen. It merely confirms that the weight is not a personal failure, nor a temporary malfunction. It belongs to the structure itself. Once this is seen, something subtle shifts, not relief, not acceptance, but a thinning of resistance. You stop asking the day to justify itself. You stop interrogating your own fatigue as though it were a problem to be solved. Fatigue becomes a condition, not a verdict. Still, the heaviness remains. It does not lift in response to insight. Insight does not function as leverage. It functions only as illumination. You see the terrain more clearly, but the distance does not shorten. The path does not smooth itself in response to understanding. As this continues, language itself begins to feel excessive. Explanations seem redundant. You find fewer reasons to articulate what is obvious from the inside. Silence becomes preferable, not because you wish to withdraw, but because nothing is gained by repetition. The weight then becomes quieter, but not lighter. It settles into the background of every thought, every action, every pause. It does not demand attention. It does not threaten collapse. It simply accompanies you, steadily, without interruption, as you continue to move through days that no longer promise anything beyond their own continuation, and you find yourself standing within this ongoingness, neither resisting nor affirming it, aware only that the motion persists, that consciousness remains present to itself, and that even this awareness, stripped of expectation, continues to observe the slow, unembellished fact of existing, without appeal, without protest, and without any clear reason to expect that the next moment will offer something fundamentally different, only that it will arrive, carrying with it the same neutral demand to remain, to bear, to notice, and to go on, because going on has not yet exhausted itself, and the thought that accompanies this persistence trails forward, unfinished, as if waiting for nothing in particular, only continuing because continuation itself has not yet been interrupted, and because the mind, even in its weariness, still follows the line of its own attention toward what has not yet been fully seen, toward the next thin recognition that approaches not as revelation but as a further narrowing of expectation, a further stripping away of what no longer insists on being believed, as the awareness remains poised within this quiet endurance, attentive to the way each moment enters without announcement, settles briefly, and then passes, leaving behind not memory, not meaning, but the simple fact that it has occurred, and that another will follow, carrying the same subdued gravity, the same unargued necessity, the same invitation to remain present without anticipation, without resistance, and without any promise that the accumulation of such moments will amount to anything beyond their own slow, unremarkable succession, which continues now, and continues still, and continues into the next breath, and into the next, as the thought itself extends forward, thinning, softening, and pausing only long enough to allow the next awareness to take its place, without closure, without emphasis, and without any indication that this quiet procession is nearing an end, but rather that it is simply proceeding, as it always has, into what remains to be noticed next, not because it promises resolution, but because attention, once engaged, follows what presents itself, and what presents itself now is thinner still, less insistent. As though even the weight has learned restraint, you begin to sense how little force is actually required for life to persist. No drama sustains it. No conviction is necessary. It continues on minimal pressure alone. The heaviness no longer presses from above. It spreads evenly, like a constant climate rather than a burden carried. You stop locating it in the body. Stop searching for where it hurts. It is no longer a sensation but a condition. The atmosphere in which sensation occurs. This makes it harder to describe, but easier to bear. Not because it is lighter, but because it no longer surprises. Thoughts change shape here. They lose their sharp edges. Questions arise less frequently. And when they do, they dissolve before demanding answers. Curiosity weakens. Not from fear, but from familiarity. You have seen enough to know the general outline of what follows, and nothing in that outline demands urgency. Time, under this gaze, becomes strangely honest. It no longer disguises itself as opportunity. It no longer threatens itself as loss. It simply unfolds, evenly, indifferent to how it is received. Morning does not promise, evening does not accuse. Each arrives with the same quiet insistence and leaves without remark. You notice that impatience has vanished, not because waiting has become pleasant, but because nothing feels worth hurrying toward. Anticipation once created tension, a leaning forward that made the present feel incomplete. Now the present stands alone, unsupported by expectation, and therefore no longer strained by it. Memory also thins, not in the sense of forgetting, but in the sense that recollection no longer carries weight. The past does not instruct, it does not warn, it does not console. It exists as evidence of continuity, nothing more. What has been survived does not confer strength, it merely confirms that survival occurred. This is where many would expect bitterness to appear, but bitterness requires accusation. It requires the belief that something was owed and withheld. That belief has already dissolved. Without it, resentment finds no surface on which to settle. What remains is neutral acknowledgement. Neutrality is often mistaken for emptiness, but emptiness suggests absence, a lack that could be filled. This is not absence. It is fullness without emphasis. Everything is present, but nothing asserts priority. Experience arrives flattened, evenly distributed, without peaks or valleys demanding allegiance. In this flattening, boredom appears not as restlessness, but as exposure. Without desire to organize experience into hierarchies of importance, moments lose distinction. They do not offend, they simply fail to differentiate themselves. Boredom here is not impatience with the world, but the world seen without exaggeration. You begin to understand why stimulation grows louder elsewhere, why lives demand constant interruption. Without interruption, this evenness becomes undeniable, and once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. Noise can cover it briefly, but silence reveals it immediately. Silence, however, is no longer frightening. Fear depended on expectation, on the idea that something should be happening and is not. That idea has weakened. Silence now feels proportional. It matches the scale of what life actually delivers when stripped of promise. At this point, effort becomes precise. You do what is required. No more, no less. Excess effort feels foolish, not because it fails, but because it misjudges the situation. Minimal compliance with existence proves sufficient. Anything beyond that feels theatrical. This precision extends inward. Emotional reactions shorten, they rise, register, and fall without elaboration. There is no inner commentary amplifying them. Joy does not linger. Discomfort does not echo. Each sensation completes itself and withdraws, leaving no residue demanding interpretation. You notice that even suffering behaves differently here. It no longer claims uniqueness. Pain, when it appears, is recognized as part of the same texture, not as an exception demanding narrative. It hurts, but it does not accuse. It does not ask to be explained. In this recognition, something like resignation emerges, but without collapse. Resignation here is not surrender to despair. It is the relinquishment of argument. You stop negotiating with conditions that do not respond to negotiation. You stop measuring what is against what should be. What remains is endurance, stripped of ornament, not perseverance toward a goal, not strength admired from the outside, but simple continuance. Breath follows breath, day follows day. There is no need to dramatize this sequence. Its persistence speaks for itself. The mind grows quieter not because it has been disciplined, but because there is less for it to do, without fantasy to maintain and hope to protect. Thought loses its compulsive rhythm. It still moves, but without urgency, as if aware that nothing depends on its speed. This quiet does not bring peace. Peace implies harmony, an alignment that resolves tension. Here, tension has merely been reduced to its baseline. The conflict between expectation and reality has ended not through reconciliation, but through exhaustion. You begin to sense how endurance differs from acceptance. Acceptance suggests approval. Endurance makes no such claim. It does not endorse life. It does not condemn it. It simply remains within it, acknowledging the terms without commentary. Under this condition, dignity takes on a different meaning. It is no longer associated with triumph or moral elevation. It resides instead in accuracy, in refusing to lie to oneself, in standing where one actually stands, without embellishment. This accuracy is solitary. It does not gather followers. It does not invite agreement. It does not translate easily into speech. Those who have not arrived here hear descriptions of it as bleak or incomplete. Those who have recognize it immediately, without relief, without alarm. As this recognition settles, even the idea of endurance begins to thin. You no longer think of yourself as enduring. You simply continue. The word itself implies effort, and effort has already been reduced to necessity. What remains is motion without ambition. And so the days proceed with this reduced friction, this muted consistency. As awareness tracks what comes and goes without attaching itself to outcome or meaning, noticing how each moment enters already diminished of promise, already relieved of demand, and how the mind, adjusted to this scale, follows along quietly, neither resisting nor affirming, allowing the sequence to carry on into what comes next, which approaches not as a development, but as a further continuation of the same subdued condition, unfolding without signal, without emphasis, and without any indication that this pattern intends to change, only that it intends to persist, and that thought itself, having narrowed its scope, trails forward gently, as if preparing to notice something even smaller, even quieter, something that requires almost no language at all, something that registers not as insight, but as the simple awareness that the movement continues, and that one continues within it, attentive still, though with less to say, and less need to say it, as the ongoingness stretches onward into the next interval of being, carrying the same restrained gravity, the same unspoken demand to remain present, and the same thinning awareness that follows along, waiting without expectation for whatever slight variation may appear next, even as it already senses that whatever arrives will do so within the same narrow bounds, asking nothing new, offering nothing more, and continuing, because continuation has not yet released its hold, and because attention, now pared down to its quiet core, remains directed forward, into the unfinished thought that has not yet reached its natural pause, but moves toward it slowly, without insistence, as though approaching a breath that has not yet been taken, not because anything is anticipated, but because awareness, once narrowed this far, has nowhere else to turn. It follows what arrives out of habit rather than hope. Each moment presents itself stripped of urgency, and the mind receives it without the reflex to assign value. You may notice how little is actually required of you now. Not courage, not belief, not enthusiasm, only presence, and even that feels less like a choice than a condition imposed by remaining conscious. You are here because consciousness has not withdrawn, and nothing more is demanded. In this state, explanations feel excessive. Causes and reasons once provided orientation, a sense that events belong to a chain that could be understood and therefore tolerated. But understanding has reached its limit. What remains does not benefit from further clarification. It simply is. You stop asking whether this is normal. Normality implies comparison, and comparison requires an external standard. Those standards have lost relevance. What you experience does not feel aberrant. It feels structurally consistent, as though this quiet heaviness were not a deviation, but an underlying truth revealed once distractions fall away. The world does not appear hostile under this gaze, nor does it appear kind. It appears indifferent in a precise way, not cruelly so. But without consideration, events occur without consulting your readiness. They pass without acknowledging your endurance. This indifference is not an insult. It is simply accurate. With this accuracy comes a subtle release from personal significance. You no longer experience each difficulty as commentary on your worth, nor each ease as validation. Circumstances lose their interpretive function. They happen, and then they do not. This alters how you relate to effort. You expend it where necessary, and withhold it where unnecessary. Without guilt or pride, there is no longer a need to prove engagement with life through excess motion. Doing enough is sufficient. More than enough feels misplaced. You may notice that even language begins to thin further. Words feel heavy, not because they are painful, but because they promise more precision than they can deliver. Silence communicates the condition more faithfully. When speech occurs, it is brief, functional, without ornament. The inner narration that once accompanied every action grows faint. You do not comment on your own movements as much. You do not narrate your endurance. You simply endure. This absence of commentary is not emptiness. It is economy. Economy extends to emotion as well. Feelings no longer cascade into one another. They arise singly, complete themselves, and withdraw. There is no surplus, no lingering charge. Emotional life becomes sparse, but clean. Some would describe this as loss, but loss implies deprivation of something that ought to be present. That judgment has already been suspended. What has faded was not essential. It was provisional, sustained by expectation rather than necessity. What remains is closer to the baseline condition of existence than anything previously experienced. Not elevated, not degraded, simply exposed. You see how little was ever guaranteed and how much was sustained by projection. This exposure does not demand response. There is nothing to correct. No adjustment will alter the fundamental arrangement. Once this is seen, the impulse to intervene weakens. Intervention suggests leverage, and leverage has proven illusory. You are left with time as it actually behaves, not as a resource, not as a threat, but as an unbroken sequence of present moments. Each moment arrives already complete, already fading. None of them accumulates into resolution. This can feel unsettling at first, because resolution was once the organizing promise. But without that promise, experience becomes strangely honest. There is no climax withheld. There is no conclusion delayed. There is only continuation. Continuation itself becomes less oppressive when it is no longer framed as waiting. Waiting implies expectation. Here, there is nothing awaited. The next moment is not better or worse than the current one. It is simply next. You may find that even the concept of meaning loses its urgency. Meaning once functioned as justification, a way to endure difficulty by placing it within a larger frame. But frames require belief. Without belief, meaning collapses into description, and description offers no consolation. This does not produce despair. Despair would still be a reaction, still a stance taken against the situation. What emerges instead is a quiet neutrality, a refusal to inflate what is given into something it is not. Under this neutrality, life feels thinner, but also less deceptive. You are no longer misled by intensity. Strong emotions no longer convince you of importance. Weak emotions no longer alarm you with absence. Everything takes its place without exaggeration. This thinning continues gradually, not toward disappearance, but toward simplicity. Needs reduce, preferences soften. You require less explanation from the day in order to pass through it. Eventually, even the idea of passing through gives way to the sense of being within. There is no destination implied, no threshold to cross, just presence within an ongoing condition that neither improves nor deteriorates in any decisive way. And so, awareness settles into this narrow channel, attentive but uninvested, observing how moments continue to arrive without promise and depart without trace, how the mind follows them with minimal commentary, how endurance persists not as a virtue but as a fact, and how this fact, once fully acknowledged, ceases to demand interpretation, leaving you standing quietly inside the unadorned continuity of existence itself, aware that nothing has been solved, nothing lifted, nothing redeemed. only that the weight remains evenly distributed across each moment, and that you remain as well, present to it, without argument, without expectation, and without any clear sense that this steady procession is moving toward a conclusion as the thought continues to extend forward, thinning further, approaching a point where even this articulation begins to feel unnecessary, and where what remains to be noticed is smaller still, quieter still. As the ongoing awareness prepares to follow the next interval of being into its own subdued arrival, waiting, not for change, but simply for the next moment to take its place, without anticipation, without reluctance, because reluctance would imply an alternative that no longer appears credible. What remains is a steady exposure to the present as it is, unmodified by expectation or protest. At this depth, even endurance loses its outline. It is no longer experienced as something you are doing. It is simply what is happening. Life continues through you with minimal resistance, as water passes through an open channel without needing affirmation from the banks. The sense of self grows quieter here, not erased, not dissolved, but reduced in emphasis. You still recognize yourself, but you no longer insist on being recognized by what passes through your days. Identity ceases to function as a project. It becomes incidental. You may notice how little is required for a day to be considered complete. The criteria once used, achievement, satisfaction, progress, have fallen away. Completion now means only that the day has ended, and that you are still present to notice its ending. Night does not arrive as relief. Morning does not arrive as burden. Both are variations within the same continuity, distinguished only by light and habit. The weight does not change with the hour. It remains consistent, impartial, uninterested in timing. Thoughts arise less frequently now, and when they do, they feel provisional, almost hesitant. They no longer rush forward to claim significance. They pass through awareness lightly, as if aware of their limited jurisdiction. This produces a peculiar calm that should not be mistaken for peace. Peace suggests reconciliation. This is merely the absence of argument. The struggle between what is and what should be has ended not because it was resolved, but because it exhausted itself. What you carry now is not despair, nor acceptance, but a steady recognition. You recognize the scale of life accurately. You no longer inflate it into something it cannot sustain, nor diminish it into something it is not. You let it remain at its natural weight. Under this recognition, suffering does not vanish, but it stops demanding interpretation. Pleasure does not disappear, but it stops promising compensation. Both take their place as transient conditions within a larger neutrality that does not privilege either. The mind, having adjusted to this proportion, becomes less restless. It no longer searches for exits or explanations. It observes. Observation becomes its primary mode, not because it is virtuous, but because it is sufficient. Silence deepens here, but it is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply expands as language withdraws. You find that fewer words are necessary to accompany experience, and fewer still to justify it. This silence does not isolate you from the world. It aligns you with it more accurately. You are no longer asking the world to respond to you personally. You are simply present within its ongoingness, subject to the same conditions as everything else. At this point, even the idea of standing becomes imprecise. There is no stance being taken. There is no position being defended. There is only the fact of being here, now. As this moment passes into the next, and the next moment does arrive, it always does, not as promise, not as threat, but as continuation. It brings with it the same restrained gravity, the same lack of emphasis, the same quiet demand to be noticed and nothing more. You notice it, because noticing is what remains when everything else has been stripped away. Attention persists, not driven by hope, not sharpened by fear, but simply because consciousness continues to register what occurs. This registration does not accumulate into meaning. It does not build toward conclusion. It does not prepare a resolution. It simply records the passage of what is given, moment by moment, without commentary. In this way, life feels heavy, not because it is cruel, nor because it has failed, but because it continues without offering justification. Its persistence is not an argument, it is a fact. To see this clearly is not liberating. It does not lighten the load, but it does remove the additional weight of illusion, expectation, and false negotiation. What remains is the weight itself, carried evenly, without embellishment. You stand within this clarity not as a victor, not as a victim, but as someone who sees accurately and therefore no longer demands what cannot be given. This accuracy offers no comfort. It offers no escape. It offers only the dignity of not being deceived. And so the procession continues, quietly, without emphasis, without destination. As each moment enters, rests briefly within awareness, and departs, leaving behind nothing but the fact of its occurrence, as consciousness follows along, attentive still, neither hopeful nor despairing, simply present to the unrelieved continuity of being here, now, and now again, as the thought itself thins to the point where even this articulation reaches its natural limit, and awareness remains, standing without illusion, within the same enduring weight that neither lifts nor crushes, but persists, evenly, as it always has, and continues on into what comes next, without requiring that it be named, understood, or resolved.